Hey book friends, welcome back to my channel. I hope you are doing well. Today I thought we could do a bit of a Q1 reading recap from January to March. I read a lot of excellent books, a lot of ones that were on my physical TBR, a lot of ARCs, a lot of new releases. I have my reading journal here as well as all of my stats on my computer. I read 22 books so far this year, and 13 of them were on my 25 for 2025 reading list, which I'm quite happy with actually. That's probably on par with the total amount of books I read on my 24 for 2024 reading list, so I'm trying to keep on top of that. Quite a few arcs in there, a whole mix of genres. We have classics, literary fiction, dystopian, a lot of translated fiction, particularly from Latin America. So without further ado, I will break down all the books I read every single month, and then we can break down these stats afterwards. For January, I read 6 books, totaled 2,100 pages. Mix of rankings kind of between a 3.75 and a 4.5, so a pretty good reading month. And I have a few of them here. So let's begin with the first one. The first book I read this year, which was on my 25 for 2025 reading list, well, it's been on my reading list forever, and I'm so glad I finally got around to it, and that is 1984 by George Orwell. We didn't have to read this in school, but I knew this was such a prevalent work of art that I needed to consume. And yeah, I have really no notes from it. My review says, "The grandfather of dystopian strikes again." I read this pretty quickly. The only parts I didn't love necessarily were, there's a book down, was Winston and Julia and sort of their relationship and how it was talked about. But on the whole, I think it was a very interesting read, and you can definitely see George Orwell's influence in more present-day dystopian reads, which was really fascinating. And yeah, so this is not the last George Orwell on this list. The next book I read, I picked up last July when I was in Paris for the Paris Olympics, and that is Blessings. This was a 2024 debut, and oh my god, what a read. This is an incredibly lyrical and intense and elegant story. It's an LGBTQ coming of age set in Nigeria in a community where same-sex relationships aren't accepted, and sort of protagonist's experience in his community and going to a boarding school and then moving into the city afterwards. This is a phenomenal work of art. I can't believe it's a debut. Let me quickly pull up my Goodreads review. It is sad, it is difficult, it is heartbreaking. It is not one to miss. So definitely recommend picking up Blessings this year if you haven't already. The third book I read this year is also my third James Baldwin, which is If Beale Street Could Talk. I've read Giovanni's Room and Another Country. Love them both. Another Country is probably one of my favorite books ever read. And when I was in New York in December, I actually went to the New York Public Library James Baldwin exhibit. He's one of my favorite authors of all time, so I'm glad I finally got around to reading this. And this is sort of a story on injustice and love and family and relationships and community. He's such an incredible writer. I don't have anything to say. Not my favorite one I've read, like Another Country, I think will be impossible to top. The way that he captures the world is just singular, and I love it. Okay, the next book I read was a memoir. It's called For the Love of a Son. It's by Scott Oake. You've probably recognized this author's name if you are Canadian. He is a sports broadcaster. You've probably heard him with hockey, Olympics, anything. He's quite popular. But this is actually a memoir about his son who passes away from a drug overdose. And this memoir is very similar to Beautiful Boy, if you've ever read that one or watched that film. However, it also expands on the impact of Scott and his wife after in them building a recovery center. I believe it was built in Winnipeg. The relationship with the community and people who misjudge it and don't understand the significance of a recovery center, and they don't want it in their community. So I definitely learned a lot from this. Obviously, it's quite sad. Impacts coast to coast to coast to coast. This is a very prevalent tale, particularly in 2025 with drug overdose crisis. But yeah, if you picked up Beautiful Boy and you want something similar and the aftermath as well of his son passing away from an overdose, definitely check this out. Okay, so my next book I read, I don't have a physical copy of, and that is My Friends by Frederick Bachman. I was very graciously gifted this arc. What do I even say about it? It is phenomenal. If you're a Frederick Bachman fan, I've only read Beartown. I read it in December and just absolutely fell in love with his storytelling. It just elicits such an emotional response when you read it. I would definitely recommend My Friends. I found the style of writing and the point of view perspective a bit difficult to get into with this one, but once you kind of get into the flow of how he writes it, it is a beautiful, beautiful coming of age tale. And it's around this girl that meets this man on a train. Well, actually they don't meet on the train, they meet before that, and she's homeless, and he is the friend of her most favorite artist. Yeah, it's just a testament to the fearlessness of childhood and friendship and love. And I don't cry, very rarely cry when reading books, and I cried reading Beartown and I cried reading My Friends. So yeah, if you love his kind of storytelling and the coming of age tales and just beautiful, beautiful writing, again, check this out. I told you it was a really great start to the year. So okay, my final book of January is an absolute mammoth. It has been on my TBR for so long, and I finally got around to it, and that is Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara. Hanya is quite a polarizing author. I'm personally someone that enjoys her writing. A Little Life was definitely an experience to read, but I found People in the Trees just like an absolutely phenomenal book. The way that she crafts, I mean, she's obviously an excellent literary fiction writer, and the way she builds characters and the relationships around them, but the way she also deals with this sort of eerie, dystopian, almost magical realism world, and you slowly realize what's happening in her book, and it just becomes an absolute horror, like in People in the Trees, then you will definitely really like To Paradise. My qualms with To Paradise, so it is broken up into 3 books. They're all about like 100 years apart. The first book is set in 1893 New York. The first book is, and then the second book is set in 1993 Hawaii, and the third book is set in 2093 New York. So it's almost like 2 historical fictions and then a dystopian future, and it is set in an alternate reality US. The first 2 books are quite a bit slower than the last book, and you really have to sink into that historical fiction style of writing. But if you can get through that, book 3 is such a breeze. I personally think that she could have split off book 3 to be on its own, and it would be held in the same space of the dystopian fiction like Handmaid's Tale or 1984. It is so well done. I don't want to give too much away. Personally, do I think you need to read the first 2 books in the book to read the last one? No. There are some connecting storylines, kinda, and an overall theme of self and identity and a few characters, but on the whole, I don't think you really need to read them. But if you do, I think it's worth it. Yeah, it's like 700 pages long. And yeah, that's the end of January. To begin February, we have 9 books that I read, and it's a mix of translated fiction, some more like literary fiction romance. Okay, I'm currently editing this video, and because I was so worried about my battery dying, I didn't include some of the stats for February and March. So for February right now, I read total 2100 pages, similar to January, and a bit more of a mix. There was 1 5-star all the way down to a 2-star, and then a lot of just kind of like 3.5 4 stars in between there. So to begin with, the first one I read was Open Water. I have been suggested to read this for years, and I picked up a thrifted copy when I was in New York back in December, so I've been patiently waiting to read it. These are the love stories that I love. I love a literary fiction that's not sort of like a contemporary romance where it's lyrical and intentional and a bit heartbreaking normally. Yes, he is such an eloquent writer, and I love when you read a book and they reference authors that you also love. For example, James Baldwin is referenced in this quite frequently, and it's kind of just a nice way to connect with the protagonist. It's such an elegant book and elegant writing. I'm intrigued to read the next, oh, this was also a debut back in the day. I'm intrigued to read his next book that has been published. Yeah, it was really short. I read it on like a bus ride, and just very beautiful writing. The next book, this is the first time I've ever listened to an audiobook, and that is From Here to the Great Unknown, the memoir with Riley Keough and Lisa Marie Presley. It is narrated by Julia Roberts for Lisa Marie Presley from her perspective, and then Riley Keough narrates her own passages. And it's definitely, if you were to read this book, I definitely recommend having it as an audiobook. I think that back and forth narration style may be confusing on the page, and they also include old voice notes from Lisa Marie Presley in the audiobook that was quite beautiful. I'm not someone that normally consumes celebrity memoirs, but I actually found that this one quite interesting and obviously heartbreaking. It's very short. It doesn't delve into as much as I think some other more Elvis literature does. But yeah, it's a great audiobook. It's quick to consume and you just learn more about this very interesting family. So that was my first and so far last audiobook I've consumed. So if you have any other recommendations, please let me know. I'm trying to do better with audiobooks. I don't think I can consume fiction with an audiobook. I really am like a visual learner and I need to see it on the page in order to absorb it. But for things like memoirs or other maybe nonfiction where you're not like following a plot, I think I could try more audiobooks for that. The next book I read was The Abyss. This is a Colombian translated fiction. It is a dark satire, an LGBTQ dark satire. I don't think dark satire is my kind of novel. I didn't love it, but I did learn a lot about Colombia in that late 90s, early 2000s phase with their political sphere and the community and what they go through. If you're into that sort of dark satire fiction, this may pique your interests, but it was a bit of a difficult read for me personally. Next, we have another book that has been on my list for way too long and an author that has been on my list for way too long. And that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is my first Jane Austen. I know. I have many more to read, but I really enjoyed it. I found it so entertaining. The whole Bennet family is just such a riot to listen to. The mom, all the sisters, and then as well, the relationship between Darcy and Elizabeth is just such a fascinating delight to read. And I had watched the 2005 movie like a few years ago and like kind of remembered it, and then after reading this I was ready to binge it all, so I watched the BBC series and I rewatched the 2005 version, and it's all amazing. I think the TV show is easier to make an adaptation just because you have a longer format to film with, but they both embrace the book in different ways. And yes, I understand the Jane Austen hype now. I have Persuasion also on my shelf, so hopefully I can get to that this year. Yeah, it was great. Obviously I love my Penguin classics. So the next book I read was an ARC on my Kindle, and that was Blue Light Hours. This was a pretty short read. It is about an international student from Brazil going to college in somewhere in New England and her relationship with her mom over Skype, as her mom still lives in Brazil. And this is definitely a book for mothers and daughters, for international students. Kind of just goes at your heart. And very interestingly, the author of this is actually the translator of one of the other books I read in February, which was a very interesting anecdote. But yeah, this is definitely just a very short, lovely read. And then I went on holiday for a few days to Mexico, and I wanted something entertaining for this flight, and I found that, and that was The Favorites. This is about two figure skaters and their very toxic, insane relationship throughout the years. I thought of this as almost like a Tessa and Scott fanfiction. If you know, you know. The best ice dance skaters of all time. This was exactly what I wanted it to be. It was entertaining, it was dramatic, it was fast, and perfect for a holiday. The part that convinced me to read it is that it's part Wuthering Heights and part Daisy Jones and the Six, which I definitely agreed. There's interview style formatting mixed into normal writing, which is very reminiscent of Daisy Jones and the Six, and I think the dramatic relationship is reminiscent of Wuthering Heights. I find it kind of funny. In Canada, we get the American copies, so they spell favorites the American way, whereas in UK and Australia, they have our spelling. But I do love this cover, so. Ooh, okay. And then my next read is an LGBTQ coming of age again, but this is a sapphic one set in Ireland, and that is Sunburn. This was an amazing, amazing read. It is very similar to Blessings, actually, with this sort of coming of age style of not being accepted in the community you are from, and how do you deal with that and how do you identify. It's just such a tender coming of age tale, and if you love that classic Irish literature style paired with sort of a sapphic coming of age romance, this one's for you. Sorry for if there's a different setup. My camera did in fact die, so I've charged it for a little bit here. I had two books left in February. One of them was Dark Side of Skin. This is a Charco Press Brazilian translated fiction. This is by far one of the most impactful books I have ever read. It is such a lyrical and intense commentary on racism and class and gender in Brazil, and it is just, I don't know, it is one of the most insane books I ever read. I binged this in one sitting. The translator is the one that wrote Blue Light Hours, actually, from a few books back, and her translation of this is just a stunning work of art. By far one of the best translated books I have ever read. My final book for January is a book on sisterhood and identity and self, and that is Shard Sisters. This is a literary fiction coming of age tale circling around a pair of sisters. The oldest one is just erratic and unpredictable, and the younger sister is cautious and studious and believes in facts and honesty. This is a book for, yeah, if you enjoy sisterhood, if you love those sort of coming of age from childhood to adulthood and seeing how decisions are made based on the relationships and how things have changed over the years. This is also a book I binged quite quickly. For March, I read 7 books and it totaled 1,900 pages, so just short of January and February, and 3 5-stars, and the others I did like 3.5, so also not a bad month. Moving into March, we begin one of my most anticipated reads of the year, and did not let me down. That is Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey. She is one of my favorite authors of all time. Migrations, one of my favorite books of all time. Wild Dark Shore, that is this one. Once They Were Wolves, also a great read. Charlotte is just an incredible author in this sort of literary fiction, climate change, mystery thriller sphere. She takes on climate change in such a non-overwhelming way. Her writing is atmospheric. The relationships between her characters are so complex and her characters are so dimensional. This particular book is about a woman who washes up on shore at this sub-Antarctic island where a man and his 3 children are the caretakers of. There's so many questions regarding why is she there, what does she want, how did she survive. Incredible book. Ooh, and thank you to Raincoast Books who gifted me this copy. I was so happy to receive this in my mail, and it came a few days before publish date. The next book is also, this was gifted to me by St. Martin's Press and actually is published today, April 1st. And that is The Sirens by Amelia Hart. You may recognize that author's name because she wrote Wayward that came out a few years ago. So if you loved Wayward, you love this sort of feminist historical fiction. This centers around 2 sisters who live in present-day Australia, and 2 sisters from over 200 years ago who are from Ireland and put on a convict boat set for Australia. And this is an amazing read on the relationships of women with nature, particularly the theme of water in this one. It has elements of magical realism in it, similar to Wayward. So if you like that sort of style of writing and that genre, check this one out. This next one is a little short and sweet book, and that is a little novella called Space Invaders. This is written by Nona Fernandez, who wrote one of my favorite books of all time, Twilight Zone. This is set in 1980s Chile at the heart of the dictatorship, and is sort of this vignette of memories of childhood amongst friends. It is an interesting read where you have these stories that are right in the playground, but also involve those nationalistic class performances, regimented school assemblies, but then also like a trip to the beach that's slid right in there. I think this pairs really well with her other novel. I think this actually came out first though, but yes, paired nicely together. And if you're interested in that sort of Chilean dictatorship from the 80s, check it out. This next book, my favorite movie of all time, is an adaptation of this book. And for the first time in my life have I ever thought that a movie adaptation is better than the original work. That is Children of Men. That movie directed by Alfonso Cuarón that came out in early 2000s with Clive Owen and Julianne Moore. By far one of the best movies I've ever read. I studied it extensively in English in high school, and then since then it has just catapulted as like one of the most genius films I've ever watched. It's an interesting film in comparison to the book because you can tell the director, I think he even stated that he never read the book and he kind of just took the plot and ran with it and the theme of the plot, and he did such a phenomenal job with it. The whole premise of Children of Men is it's a dystopian if the world, the human race, had become infertile. Yeah, ultimately compared to the movie, it just isn't quite up to par, but this was still a pretty solid dystopian read. Keeping on the theme of dystopian, we have one of the most anticipated releases of the year, Sunrise on the Reaping, Suzanne Collins. Suzanne does such an incredible job connecting the world and characters and previous events from the original trilogy and its predecessor into this book. But I also think more importantly is this sort of deeper commentary on propaganda and the manipulation of art to serve this authoritarian government is so well needed in 2025. And I love her reach and how popular this book has become, and hopefully it makes people critically think about the content they are reading and how it impacts and reflects the world around them. Please pick this up. I think obviously if you haven't read the originals, maybe read those first and then come to this. I don't think you have to read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes before reading this, but I do think you'll have a more fulfilled reading experience if you do. To tie nicely with that, in terms of political commentary, we have an essay collection from no other than George Orwell. This is Why I Write. This is a selection of essays he wrote in 1940s, sort of right at the height of World War II, and it's commentary on fascism, sort of the class structure of the UK at the time, and still to this day I suppose, Germany and other governments. Just such a searing political commentary from him, and you understand his background and how he, you know, wrote 1984, and this paired quite nicely with Sunrise on the Reaping, so I enjoyed that. My final book so far from this quarter is one that I borrowed from the library actually, so I don't have it with me, but I loved it so much that I bought my own copy, and that is The Prettiest Star. This book is by far one of the most heart-wrenching and devastating books I have ever read. It is about a young man who moves from New York back to his small hometown in 1986 after he was diagnosed with AIDS. It is so devastating, it's so captivating. The whole relationship with his neighbors and his town, his family, his brother, or not his brother, his sister, his mom and dad, his cousins, his aunt and uncles. I cried. Again, I don't cry when reading books, but this made me tear up at how horrible people treated him in this time frame, and having to go from New York and his community of friends, who sadly have all already passed away from this epidemic, to return to the hometown where he's originally from. And it's just, this happened to so many men. It's by far one of the most captivating and devastating reads I have ever read. Out of all of these books, it's probably my most impactful read by far. Okay, welcome back for a third time. My resolution going forward is to make sure I have a charged camera. I wanted to review some of my stats from the last quarter. I finally made a story graph. I only ever used Goodreads before, but I was envious of everybody's stats, and so I inputted all my data. And so I'm just gonna read and show some of the graphs here. So in terms of my moods, my top 3 moods were emotional, reflective, sad, followed by dark. If that summarizes the kind of books I like to read, it is what it is. Pace, it was like 50% medium pace, 25% fast, 25% slow. Page number, this is something that I want to work on going forward, but 64% of my reads were under 300 pages, 32% were 300 to 499 pages, and only one book, which was To Paradise, was above 500 pages. I love reading a long book that I can just get completely immersed in, so I definitely want to work on reading longer reads going forward. And also, 86% of my reads were fiction and 14% were nonfiction. And then one of the other comments I was going to add was 5 out of those 22 books were ARCs or gifted, and the rest were bought or from the library. Resolution going forward, besides charging my camera, is reading more nonfiction again and reading longer books. In terms of genres, literary is at the top, kind of followed by that LGBTQ, dystopian, classics, that sort of thing. I'm pretty happy with my genres. It's quite a wide mix of everything, but ultimately I want to read longer books and more nonfiction. Okay, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Going forward, I'll definitely have a charged camera. 2, if there's any books you'd like to see me read in the next quarter, please let me know down below. And 3, please follow my TikTok or Instagram. I definitely post on there much more frequently than my YouTube. But if there is any book videos you'd like to see on here, please let me know as well. Without further ado, I will see you guys in my next book video. Thanks.